thought the trail had gone cold until the moment she found the basement door, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw inside, or who was waiting for her in the dark. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. Boston, Massachusetts, November 1902. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the cobblestones of Beacon Hill, turning the gas-lit streets into rivers of amber light and shadow. Detective Constance Victoria Hayes stood beneath the awning of the Metropolitan Police Headquarters, watching the downpour with tired eyes. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the finest investigators in the department, though her position remained unofficial. A consulting detective, they called her, since women were not permitted to hold formal rank. She had learned to accept the title with grace, knowing that her work spoke louder than any badge ever could. The telegram in her gloved hand trembled slightly, not from the cold November wind, but from the weight of its contents. A missing person case. A young woman named Catherine Ashford, daughter of the prominent industrialist Robert Ashford, had vanished from her family estate 3 days prior. The circumstances were peculiar. No signs of struggle, no ransom demands, simply an empty bedroom with an open window overlooking the garden. The police had investigated briefly before dismissing it as a probable elopement, but Catherine's mother refused to accept such an explanation. She had specifically requested Constance's assistance, having heard of her success in locating the missing daughter of a senator the previous spring. Constance folded the telegram carefully and tucked it into her leather satchel. She would need to visit the Ashford estate tomorrow morning, first thing. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the streets were becoming impassable. She pulled her dark wool coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped out into the deluge, her boots splashing through puddles as she made her way toward the boarding house where she kept her modest rooms. The gas lamps flickered in their iron casings, casting dancing shadows across the wet brick facades. Constance had always loved Boston in the autumn, despite the harsh weather. There was something romantic about the old city during this season. The way the fog rolled in from the harbor, the scent of wood smoke from countless fireplaces, the quiet dignity of the Georgian architecture that lined these historic streets. Her father had been a police officer here, back when the force was smaller and the city less complicated. He had taught her everything he knew before consumption took him when she was only 16. Her mother had passed years earlier, leaving Constance with little family except for a distant aunt in Providence, whom she rarely saw. As she turned onto Charles Street, Constance nearly collided with a tall figure emerging from a bookshop. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could slip on the wet pavement. "My sincere apologies, miss," a deep voice said, concern evident in its tone. "I should have been watching where I was going." Constance looked up into a pair of striking gray eyes set in a handsome, angular face. The man was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair dampened by the rain and the bearing of someone accustomed to physical activity. He wore a well-tailored charcoal suit beneath a black overcoat and carried a leather-bound book tucked under one arm. His grip on her shoulders was gentle but firm, and he released her the moment she had regained her balance. "No harm done," Constance replied, finding herself momentarily caught by his direct gaze. There was an intensity to it, an intelligence that suggested this was not a man who missed much. "The fault was equally mine. This weather makes visibility rather challenging." "Indeed it does." He smiled, and the expression transformed his serious features into something warmer. "Permit me to introduce myself. I am Dr. William Benjamin Crawford, recently arrived from Philadelphia. I've taken a position at Massachusetts General Hospital in their surgical department." "Detective Constance Hayes," she responded, extending her hand in the forthright manner that sometimes scandalized more traditional society. "Though I must confess, consulting detective is the more accurate title, as the department has not yet seen fit to grant women official status." Dr. Crawford took her hand with evident respect, his handshake firm and professional. "A consulting detective? How fascinating. I've read about such work in the London papers. The concept of investigative specialists working alongside the regular police force. I imagine it requires considerable skill and dedication." "It requires stubbornness more than anything else," Constance said with a slight smile, "and a willingness to tolerate a certain amount of skepticism from one's colleagues. I can well imagine." His gray eyes held a knowing look. "I've encountered similar resistance in my own profession. The medical establishment can be remarkably resistant to new ideas, particularly when they come from those they consider outsiders. He shifted the book under his arm, and Constance caught a glimpse of the title, a medical text on forensic pathology. Forgive me for asking, but would you happen to know of any reputable boarding houses in this area? I've only just arrived in Boston this afternoon, and the establishment where I've taken temporary rooms is rather less comfortable than I had hoped. Constance hesitated only a moment before replying. There was something about this man that inspired trust, perhaps the directness of his gaze, or the quiet confidence in his manner. Mrs. Pemberton runs an excellent establishment just 3 blocks from here on Pinckney Street. Very respectable, quiet, and the rooms are well maintained. She's selective about her tenants, but if you mention my name, she'll at least give you a fair hearing. That's extraordinarily kind of you, Miss Hayes. Doctor, Crawford said, and she could hear the genuine gratitude in his voice. I don't suppose you might be walking in that direction. I confess I'm still learning my way around these streets, and in this rain, everything looks rather similar. As it happens, Mrs. Pemberton's house is directly next to my own lodgings, Constance replied. I would be happy to show you the way, Dr. Crawford. They walked together through the rain-soaked streets, their conversation flowing with surprising ease. Dr. Crawford explained that he had come to Boston to study under Dr. Henry Bowditch, one of the foremost authorities on internal medicine in the country. He had particular interests in forensic medicine, the application of medical knowledge to legal questions, a field that was still relatively new but growing in importance. I believe that medicine and law enforcement should work more closely together, he said as they climbed the gentle slope of Pinckney Street. There is so much that can be learned from careful examination of physical evidence, from understanding the medical aspects of suspicious deaths. In Europe, they've begun to establish what they call medico-legal institutes, facilities where doctors and investigators can collaborate on difficult cases. That sounds remarkably progressive, Constance replied, her interest genuinely piqued. I've often thought that our investigations would benefit from greater scientific rigor. Too often, conclusions are drawn based on assumption rather than careful analysis. Precisely my point, Dr. Crawford said with evident enthusiasm. The human body tells a story if one knows how to read it properly. Wounds, poisons, the timing of death, all of these things can be determined with reasonable accuracy using proper medical techniques. They had reached Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, an elegant 3-story brick building with black shutters and a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. The windows glowed warmly with lamplight, and smoke rose invitingly from the chimneys. Constance's own lodgings were in the identical building directly next door, separated only by a narrow alley. This is the place, Constance said, gesturing toward the front steps. Mrs. Pemberton is somewhat formidable, but fair-minded. She values cleanliness, punctuality, and discretion above all else. Sounds like an excellent landlady, Dr. Crawford replied. He extended his hand once more. Thank you again, Miss Hayes, for your kindness to a stranger. I hope we might meet again under more pleasant weather conditions. I suspect we shall, Dr. Crawford, Constance said, shaking his hand. Boston is a large city, but certain circles within it are quite small. She watched as he climbed the steps and rang the bell, then turned to enter her own building next door. As she climbed the narrow staircase to her second-floor rooms, Constance found herself thinking about the doctor's intelligent gray eyes and the passionate way he had spoken about his work. There was something kindred in his dedication to his profession, a seriousness of purpose that she recognized in herself. Her rooms were modest but comfortable, a sitting room with a small desk where she kept her case notes, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and wardrobe, and access to a shared washroom at the end of the hall. She lit the oil lamp on her desk and removed her damp coat, hanging it carefully on the hook behind the door. The telegram about Catherine Ashford's disappearance lay on the desk where she had placed it, and she picked it up again, studying the sparse details. Tomorrow she would visit the Ashford estate and begin her investigation. But tonight, as the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, she found her thoughts drifting back to the chance encounter on Charles Street. Dr. William Crawford. There had been something in his manner, in the way he had spoken about his work with such conviction, that had stirred something in her. A recognition, perhaps, of a fellow outsider trying to forge a place in a world not quite ready to accept them. She shook her head slightly, dismissing such fanciful thoughts. She had a case to prepare for, and personal speculation would only distract her from the work ahead. Yet as she settled into her chair and began reviewing her notes on missing persons cases, she could not quite banish the memory of those gray eyes meeting hers in the rain-swept street, nor the unexpected warmth of that brief connection in the cold November night. The morning arrived with a pale November sun struggling through dissipating clouds. Constance dressed carefully in a tailored navy walking suit, pinning her auburn hair into a practical chignon at the nape of her neck. She selected a small notebook and pencil for her satchel, along with a magnifying glass her father had given her years ago, its brass handle worn smooth from countless investigations. The Ashford estate was located in the affluent neighborhood of Brookline, requiring a carriage ride of nearly 40 minutes through the awakening city. As she descended the stairs of her boarding house, she was surprised to find Dr. Crawford emerging from Mrs. Pemberton's establishment next door. He carried a black medical bag and wore the same charcoal suit from the previous evening, though now covered by a different overcoat of deep burgundy wool. "Miss Hayes," he greeted her with a warm smile. "What a pleasant coincidence. I trust you slept well despite the storm?" "Well enough, thank you, Dr. Crawford," Constance replied. "I see Mrs. Pemberton found you acceptable as a tenant." "She did indeed, though I suspect your recommendation carried considerable weight." He glanced down the street where a horse-drawn carriage was approaching. "Are you heading to an investigation this morning?" "I am. A missing person case in Brookline. A young woman who vanished from her family estate 3 nights ago." Constance hesitated, then added, "The circumstances are rather peculiar. No evidence of forced entry or struggle, yet the family insists she would never have left voluntarily." Dr. Crawford's expression grew serious. "Missing persons cases can be quite troubling. The first few days are crucial, I understand." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "Forgive me if this seems presumptuous, but I'm heading to the hospital and Brookline is directly on my route. Would you permit me to share your carriage?" "I would be happy to contribute to the fare, naturally." Constance found herself agreeing before she had fully considered the impropriety of traveling alone with a man she had only just met. Yet something about Dr. Crawford's straightforward manner put her at ease. They settled into the carriage together, maintaining a respectful distance on the leather seats as the driver urged the horses forward through the busy morning streets. "You mentioned yesterday that you have an interest in forensic medicine," Constance said as they passed through the public garden. "Have you had much practical experience in that field?" "Some, Doctor," Crawford replied, watching the bare trees slide past the window. "In Philadelphia, I worked with the coroner's office on several difficult cases. There was one in particular, a woman found dead in her home under circumstances that initially appeared to be natural causes. But something troubled me about the coloring of her skin, certain marks around her mouth. Upon closer examination, I was able to determine that she had been poisoned with arsenic over a period of several weeks. Her husband was eventually convicted of her murder." "How extraordinary," Constance said, leaning forward slightly in genuine fascination. "The ability to detect such things must require considerable knowledge and attention to detail." "Not unlike detective work, I would imagine," Dr. Crawford responded, turning to meet her gaze. "We are both, in our own ways, seeking truth through careful observation and logical deduction. The methods differ, but the fundamental purpose is the same." Their conversation continued throughout the journey, ranging from the challenges they each faced in their respective professions to their observations about Boston society. Constance found herself surprised by how easily she spoke with this man, how their minds seemed to work in similar patterns. He did not condescend to her or question her capabilities as so many men did. Instead, he listened with genuine interest and treated her insights with respect. The Ashford estate was an imposing structure of gray stone and dark timber, set back from the road behind elaborate iron gates. Bare oak trees lined the curved drive, their branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. Gardens that would be magnificent in spring now lay dormant beneath a covering of fallen leaves. The house itself was a fine example of Victorian Gothic architecture, with pointed arch windows and decorative stonework that must have cost a fortune to commission. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, Dr. Crawford touched Constance's arm lightly. "I hope you don't think me too forward, Miss Hayes, but if you require any medical expertise during your investigation, any questions about physical evidence or the like, please don't hesitate to contact me at the hospital. I would be glad to assist in any way I can." "That is very generous, Dr. Crawford," Constance replied sincerely. "I may well take you up on that offer. Thank you." She watched as the carriage continued down the drive, carrying Dr. Crawford toward his hospital duties, before turning her attention to the mansion before her. A severe-looking butler answered her knock and escorted her through a marble-floored entrance hall into a drawing room decorated in heavy velvets and dark wood furniture. Mrs. Margaret Ashford rose from a settee to greet her, a woman of perhaps 50, elegantly dressed in deep purple silk, her face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. "Miss Hayes, thank you for coming so promptly," Mrs. Ashford said, clasping Constance's hands with desperate urgency. "The police have been utterly useless. They spent perhaps 2 hours here, asked a few cursory questions, and then declared that Catherine must have run off with some unsuitable young man. But I know my daughter, Miss Hayes. She would never simply disappear without a word. Something terrible has happened to her, I'm certain of it. Please, Mrs. Ashford, sit down and tell me everything," Constance said gently, guiding the distraught woman back to the settee. "Start from the beginning. When did you last see Catherine?" Mrs. Ashford took a steadying breath. 3 nights ago, at dinner. She seemed perfectly normal. Perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but nothing alarming. She retired to her room around 9 o'clock, as she always does. She reads before bed, you see. The next morning, when her maid went to wake her, the room was empty. The window was open, the curtains blowing in the breeze. Catherine was simply gone. And nothing else was disturbed? No clothing taken? No personal items missing? That's what makes it so strange, Mrs. Ashford said, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. All her belongings were exactly as they should be. Her jewelry, her money, even her warmest cloak, all still in her wardrobe. What young woman runs away without taking anything with her? Constance made careful notes in her book. What about her state of mind in the days leading up to her disappearance? Had she seemed troubled, anxious, different in any way? Mrs. Ashford hesitated, her eyes flickering away briefly before returning to meet Constance's gaze. There was something. About a week before she vanished, Catherine received a letter. She wouldn't tell me who it was from, but I could see that it upset her greatly. She became withdrawn, secretive. I found her several times staring out windows, lost in thought, as though wrestling with some difficult decision. Do you still have this letter? No. Catherine burned it. I saw her do it in the fireplace in her room. She didn't realize I was watching. I see. Constance closed her notebook. Mrs. Ashford, I need to examine Catherine's room thoroughly. Every detail, no matter how small, may prove significant. The bedroom was located on the 2nd floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with family portraits. It was a young woman's room, decorated in soft blues and whites, with lace curtains that still stirred gently in the draft from the partially open window. Constance moved slowly through the space, observing everything with careful attention. The bed was neatly made, too neatly perhaps, suggesting Catherine had not slept in it that final night. The wardrobe stood open, revealing rows of dresses and day suits, all expensive and well-maintained. Constance crossed to the window and examined the frame closely. There were no marks suggesting a forced entry, but when she looked down, something caught her eye. Caught on a splinter in the wooden windowsill was a single thread of dark fabric, coarse wool, definitely not from any of Catherine's fine clothing. She carefully extracted it and placed it in a small envelope from her satchel. The escritoire in the corner yielded more interesting findings. Most of the papers were innocuous: social correspondence, sketches of garden designs, poetry copied in Catherine's careful hand. But in a locked drawer, which Constance opened using a hairpin with practiced ease, she found a small diary. The entries were brief and cryptic, but one from the previous month caught her attention. He says he knows the truth about Father's business. He says he can prove it. What am I to do? Constance was still pondering this entry when Mrs. Ashford appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and a commanding presence. This could only be Robert Ashford himself. "Mrs. Ashford tells me you're some sort of private detective," he said without preamble, his tone suggesting skepticism. "I must say, I don't approve of my wife engaging in such sensationalism. The police have already determined that Catherine has likely eloped. We should simply wait for her to come to her senses and return home." "Mr. Ashford," Constance replied evenly, "I've found evidence that suggests your daughter did not leave this house willingly. There are questions that need answering before we can accept such a simple explanation." His face darkened. What sort of questions? Questions about who might have wanted to harm or threaten Catherine. Questions about this business matter she referenced in her diary. Constance held up the small, leather-bound book. She wrote that someone claimed to have proof of something involving your business dealings. Do you know what that might refer to? Robert Ashford's expression became glacial. My business affairs are none of your concern, young woman, and I'll thank you not to pry into matters you couldn't possibly understand. Catherine was always prone to dramatics and foolish imaginings. Robert, Mrs. Ashford protested, how can you speak so callously when our daughter is missing? But her husband had already turned and strode from the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Mrs. Ashford looked at Constance with desperate eyes. Please don't let his manner discourage you, Miss Hayes. Robert he's worried, though he would never admit it. His pride won't allow him to show weakness. I understand, Constance said, though privately she wondered what secrets Robert Ashford might be hiding. Mrs. Ashford, I need you to think carefully. Did Catherine have any particular friends? Anyone she might have confided in about whatever was troubling her? The older woman considered this. There was a young woman named Victoria Sutton. She and Catherine attended finishing school together. Victoria lives with her family on Commonwealth Avenue. They were quite close at one time, though I believe they had some sort of falling out recently. Constance made note of the address. Thank you. I'll call on Miss Sutton this afternoon. In the meantime, if you think of anything else, any detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please send word to me immediately. As Constance prepared to leave the estate, she noticed something she had missed upon arrival. Near the garden gate, partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery, was a small groundskeeper's cottage. Smoke rose from its chimney, suggesting it was occupied. On impulse, she decided to investigate. The cottage door was answered by a weathered man in his 60s, his hands stained with soil and his clothing rough but clean. Can I help you, miss? I'm investigating Miss Ashford's disappearance, Constance explained. I wondered if you might have seen or heard anything unusual 3 nights ago. The groundskeeper, whose name was Samuel, he told her, scratched his jaw thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, I did hear something. Must have been around midnight or thereabouts. I was having trouble sleeping, you see, and I thought I heard voices down by the old basement entrance at the side of the house. Men's voices, low and urgent-like. Couldn't make out what they were saying, but it struck me as odd at that hour. The basement entrance. Constance felt a flutter of excitement. Could you show me? Samuel led her around the east wing of the mansion to a spot partially concealed by ancient rhododendrons. There, set into the foundation, was a heavy wooden door with iron hinges, clearly very old, probably original to the house's construction. Constance tried the handle and found it locked. Does anyone use this entrance anymore? She asked. Not that I know of, miss. Mr. Ashford had all the cellars sealed up years ago. Said they were unsafe, water damage and such. But when Constance knelt to examine the lock more closely, she could see fresh scratches in the metal, the telltale marks of recent use. Someone had opened this door quite recently. Possibly that very night Catherine disappeared. Samuel, do you know who might have keys to this basement door? Just Mr. Ashford himself, far as I know. Though I suppose some of the older servants might have copies from years back. Constance thanked the groundskeeper and made her way back to the main drive, where she arranged for a carriage to take her back to Boston. Her mind was racing with possibilities. Catherine had been troubled by some secret regarding her father's business. She had received a threatening letter, and on the night she vanished, men had been heard near a supposedly sealed basement entrance. None of this suggested a simple elopement. By the time she returned to Beacon Hill, the afternoon was waning. Constance decided to visit Miss Victoria Sutton before the day grew too late. The Sutton residence on Commonwealth Avenue was grand but welcoming, with gas lamps already glowing in the windows against the gathering dusk. Victoria Sutton proved to be a striking young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She received Constance in a small sitting room decorated in the latest fashion, all light colors and delicate furnishings. When Constance explained the reason for her visit, Victoria's expression grew troubled. I was wondering when someone would come asking about Catherine, she said quietly. The police certainly didn't bother. They interviewed me for perhaps 5 minutes and seemed wholly uninterested in anything I had to say. I'm interested in everything you can tell me, Constance assured her. Mrs. Ashford mentioned that you and Catherine had been close friends, but had recently experienced some difficulty. May I ask what caused the rift between you? Victoria stood and moved to the window, her posture tense. Catherine discovered something about her father. Something terrible. She wouldn't tell me all the details, but I know it involved his shipping business. There were irregularities, she said. False manifests, secret cargo. She was terrified of what might happen if the truth came out. When did she tell you this? About 2 months ago. She was desperate for advice, for someone to confide in. But I'm ashamed to say I told her to forget what she'd learned, to stay quiet for the sake of her family's reputation. Victoria turned back to face Constance, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We argued about it. I said she was being reckless and foolish to even consider exposing her own father. She called me a coward. We haven't spoken since. Do you know who told Catherine about these supposed irregularities? A man named Henry Blackwood. He works, or worked, as a clerk in Mr. Ashford's shipping office. Catherine said he had proof of everything, documents that could ruin her father. He was pressuring her to help him expose the truth, but she was torn. She loved her father, despite everything. Constance felt the pieces beginning to align in her mind. Miss Sutton, do you know where I might find this Henry Blackwood? He has rooms above a tavern near the docks. The Silver Anchor, I believe it's called. But Miss Hayes... Victoria paused, her expression fearful. Be careful. If Mr. Ashford is truly involved in the sort of criminal activities Catherine suspected, he won't take kindly to anyone investigating. And men like that, they have ways of protecting their interests. As Constance left the Sutton residence, the full darkness of evening had settled over Boston. The gas lamps cast pools of yellow light along Commonwealth Avenue, and a cold wind carried the scent of the harbor. She knew she should return to her lodgings, that visiting the docks at night was potentially dangerous, but the urgency of Catherine's disappearance drove her forward. The Silver Anchor was exactly the sort of establishment one would expect near the waterfront. Rough, noisy, and redolent of ale and tobacco smoke. Constance drew her cloak tightly around herself and climbed the narrow stairs to the rooms above. At the top, she found a dimly lit hallway with several doors. The one at the far end bore a small brass nameplate, H. Blackwood. She knocked firmly. No response. She tried again, then tested the handle. The door swung open, unlocked. The room beyond was small and sparsely furnished. Papers were scattered everywhere, as though someone had conducted a hasty search. But what made Constance's heart race was the dark stain on the wooden floor near the window, a stain that could only be blood. She was still standing frozen in the doorway when she heard footsteps on the stairs behind her. She turned to find Dr. William Crawford ascending toward her, his medical bag in hand and surprise evident on his face. Miss Hayes, what on earth are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, Dr. Crawford, she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. I was summoned to attend to a man who'd been injured in a brawl downstairs, he explained, then noticed the open door and the scene within. His expression grew grave. Is this connected to your missing person case? I believe so, and I'm very much afraid that this investigation has just become considerably more serious. Dr. Crawford stepped carefully into the room, his medical training evident in the systematic way he surveyed the scene. He knelt beside the blood stain, examining it with professional detachment, while Constance watched from the doorway, her mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered. This blood is relatively fresh, Dr. Crawford said quietly, touching the edge of the stain with his fingertip. No more than 24 hours old, I would estimate. The pattern suggests a significant injury, perhaps a blow to the head or a stabbing wound. There's quite a lot of it, which concerns me greatly. Henry Blackwood, Constance said, more to herself than to the doctor. He was a clerk in Robert Ashford's shipping office. According to Catherine's friend, he had evidence of criminal activities, false manifests, illegal cargo. He was pressuring Catherine to help him expose her father. Dr. Crawford rose and moved to the desk, where papers lay in disarray. It appears someone searched this room quite thoroughly. Looking for those documents, perhaps? He picked up a torn envelope, examining it in the lamplight. This is addressed to Blackwood, postmarked 5 days ago. No return address, but look at the postmark. It's from New Bedford, not Boston. Constance crossed to his side, studying the envelope. New Bedford is a major whaling port, but it's also become significant for shipping more generally. If Ashford's company operates ships out of there, it would make sense as a location for illegal activities, far enough from Boston to avoid close scrutiny. Miss Hayes, I think we need to inform the police about what we've found here, Dr. Crawford said, his gray eyes serious. This is clearly a crime scene. possibly even a murder. Whatever investigation you're conducting, it has now become something far more dangerous. You're absolutely right, Constance agreed, though her mind was already working through the complications. But I'm concerned about who we can trust. If Robert Ashford is truly involved in criminal activities significant enough to murder for, he undoubtedly has connections within the police department. The wrong word to the wrong person could jeopardize not only the investigation, but Catherine's safety, if she's still alive. Dr. Crawford studied her face intently. You believe Miss Ashford is somehow connected to what happened here? I believe she discovered her father's secrets and was caught between her conscience and her loyalty to her family. When Blackwood pressed her to help expose the truth, she may have agreed, or he may have taken action without her consent. Either way, she became a liability. Constance moved to the window, looking down at the darkened street below. 3 nights ago, men were heard near the basement entrance of the Ashford estate at midnight, a basement that's supposedly been sealed for years. The next morning, Catherine was gone. Her window open, no belongings taken. I think she was taken, Dr. Crawford. I think she's being held somewhere, probably to ensure her silence. Then we need to find her quickly, Dr. Crawford said with quiet determination. If your theory is correct, her captors may not keep her alive once they've secured whatever they're trying to protect. Constance turned back to face him, surprised by his immediate acceptance of her reasoning and his willingness to involve himself in what was clearly a dangerous situation. Dr. Crawford, you barely know me, and this is not your concern. You've already done more than enough by sharing your medical expertise. I cannot ask you to. You're not asking, he interrupted gently. I'm offering. Miss Hayes, Constance, if I may, I've spent my career studying death and its causes. I've examined the victims of violence, analyzed the aftermath of cruelty and crime, but I've always arrived too late to prevent the tragedy. For once I find myself in a position to perhaps save a life, rather than simply documenting its loss. I will not stand aside. The use of her Christian name, spoken with such earnest conviction, sent an unexpected warmth through Constance's chest. She met his gaze and saw in those gray eyes the same fierce dedication that drove her own work. Very well, William, she said, using his given name in turn. Then we must work quickly and carefully. First, we need to search this room more thoroughly. Whatever documents Blackwood had, if they're not here, someone took them. But there may be other clues. Correspondence, notes, anything that might tell us where Catherine is being held. They worked together for the next hour, examining every corner of the small room. Dr. Crawford's methodical nature complemented Constance's intuitive leaps perfectly. He found a false bottom in one of the desk drawers, which yielded a small journal filled with numbers and abbreviations. Clearly some sort of code or accounting record. Constance discovered a letter tucked behind a loose board in the wall, written in a feminine hand that she recognized from Catherine's diary as belonging to the missing woman. Listen to this, Constance said, reading aloud by the lamplight. Dear Mr. Blackwood, I have given much thought to our last conversation and to the evidence you showed me. My conscience will not permit me to remain silent about such grave wrongdoing regardless of the personal cost. I have decided to help you gather the additional proof you need. There is a place in our home where my father keeps his most private papers, a safe hidden in the basement behind the old wine racks. I can provide you access, but we must be extremely careful. If he suspects what we're doing, I fear what might happen to both of us. I will send word when the opportunity presents itself. Please destroy this letter after reading it. C.A. She was going to betray her father. Doctor, Crawford said softly. Whatever moral struggle she was engaged in, she ultimately chose truth over loyalty. That's remarkably brave. And remarkably dangerous, Constance added. This letter is dated 2 weeks ago. Blackwood clearly didn't destroy it as she asked. And if I'm right, Robert Ashford discovered their plan before they could execute it. The basement, Dr. Crawford said suddenly. You mentioned earlier that men were heard near a basement entrance the night Miss Ashford disappeared. That must be where they took her, into the very place she intended to help Blackwood access. The irony is rather grim. Constance folded the letter carefully and placed it in her satchel. We need to get inside that basement, but we can't simply march up to the front door and demand access. Ashford would never permit it, and if Catherine is being held there, alerting him to our suspicions could seal her fate. Then we'll need to find another way in, Dr. Crawford said practically. You said there's an exterior entrance, the one where the men were heard that night? Yes, but it's locked, and undoubtedly Ashford has the only key. Constance paused, an idea forming. Unless Samuel, the groundskeeper, mentioned that older servants might have copies from years ago. If I could speak with some of the former household staff, someone who worked there before the basement was sealed. Mrs. Pemberton, Dr. Crawford said suddenly. She's been managing boarding houses in Boston for over 30 years. She knows everyone, and she has an extraordinary memory for household connections. If anyone would know where to find former Ashford servants, it would be her. They left Blackwood's room carefully, closing the door behind them to avoid attracting attention to what they had discovered. The tavern below was still noisy with evening patrons, and no one paid them any mind as they descended to the street. Dr. Chu. Crawford hailed a carriage, and they rode through the darkened streets toward Beacon Hill, their conversation continuing in urgent whispers. "There's something else troubling me," Constance said as they passed through the financial district, its tall buildings looming like dark sentinels. "Even if we find Catherine and free her, what then? Her father is clearly a powerful man with criminal connections. He won't simply allow his daughter to testify against him. She'll be in danger for as long as he remains free, which means we need evidence sufficient to ensure his arrest and prosecution," Dr. Crawford replied. "The documents Blackwood was collecting. If we can find those, along with whatever papers Ashford keeps in that basement safe, we might have enough to convince the authorities to act. Assuming we can find authorities we trust," Constance said darkly. "Corruption tends to run deep in cases like this." Mrs. Pemberton was surprised but gracious when Constance and Dr. Crawford appeared at her door well past the customary calling hours. The older woman listened to their carefully edited explanation. They needed to locate a former Ashford servant for an investigation, but could not provide details. With shrewd eyes that suggested she understood far more than they were saying. "The Ashfords," she said thoughtfully, settling into her chair in the parlor. "I know the family by reputation, of course. Very wealthy, very secretive. There was a housekeeper who worked for them for many years, Mrs. Dorothy Chen. Her mother was Chinese, which caused quite a scandal at the time, but she was apparently an exceptional worker. She left the Ashford employ about 5 years ago, I believe. She runs a small boarding house now over on West Cedar Street, just a few blocks from here. Would she be willing to speak with us, do you think?" Constance asked. "That depends on what you want to discuss," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "Dorothy is a very private person and fiercely loyal to those who treat her well, but she also has a strong sense of justice. If she believed someone was in danger—" The older woman fixed them both with a penetrating look. "This is about the missing Ashford girl, isn't it? I read about it in the papers. We believe Miss Ashford may be in grave danger," Dr. Crawford said carefully. "We're trying to help her, but we need information that only someone familiar with the household might possess." Mrs. Pemberton nodded slowly. "I'll write you a note of introduction to Dorothy. Show her that, and she'll at least hear you out. But be warned, if she thinks you're working for Robert Ashford or mean any harm to that girl, she'll throw you out on your ears. She never liked the man, though she was always fond of his wife and daughter." Armed with Mrs. Pemberton's note, Constance and Dr. Crawford made their way through the quiet streets to West Cedar Street. The boarding house was modest but well-maintained, with warm light glowing in the windows. A small, elegant woman of perhaps 60 answered their knock, Dorothy Chen, her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. After reading Mrs. Pemberton's note, she invited them inside to a tidy parlor that smelled pleasantly of tea and beeswax. Constance explained the situation as thoroughly as she dared, leaving out only the details about Blackwood's disappearance and the blood they had found. She did, however, show Mrs. Chen the letter Catherine had written to Blackwood. The former housekeeper's expression grew increasingly troubled as she read. "That poor child," she murmured. "I always worried what might become of her, growing up in that house with those secrets." "You knew about Mr. Ashford's criminal activities?" Constance asked carefully. "I knew he was not an honest man," Mrs. Chen replied. "I saw things during my years there. Strange visitors at odd hours, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, locked doors that were never to be opened. And the basement, he had me dismiss all the staff who had worked there, claimed it was unsafe due to water damage, but I knew that was a lie. I'd been in those cellars many times. They were solid as bedrock." Mrs. Chen, Dr. Crawford leaned forward intently. "Do you by any chance still have a key to the basement entrance? The exterior door on the east side of the house?" The older woman was silent for a long moment, her expression conflicted. Finally, She rose and crossed to a small cabinet from which she withdrew a ring of old iron keys. When Mr. Ashford dismissed me, I was angry. I'd given that family 15 years of loyal service, and he cast me aside without so much as a proper reference, just because I'd been in the basement one day when I shouldn't have been. I'd heard noises, you see, and went to investigate. Whatever he was doing down there, he didn't want any witnesses. She selected one large, ornate key from the ring. I kept this as a sort of insurance, I suppose. I told myself I might need it someday to prove what I'd seen, but I never had the courage to use it. If Catherine is truly down there, though, she pressed the key into Constance's hand. Bring her home safely. That girl deserves better than the hand she's been dealt. By the time Constance and Dr. Crawford departed Mrs. Chen's boarding house, it was past 11 o'clock. The streets of Beacon Hill were largely deserted, the gas lamps casting long shadows across the cobblestones. They stood together on the sidewalk, the weight of what they were about to attempt settling over them. We should go tonight, Constance said quietly. If Catherine is in that basement, every hour we delay increases the risk. Agreed, Dr. Crawford replied. But we'll need to be extremely careful. If we're caught breaking into the Ashford estate, at best we'll be arrested for trespassing. At worst, he didn't need to finish the thought. I have a small pistol, Constance said. My father's service revolver. I've never had cause to use it, but I know how. Dr. Crawford nodded. And I have my medical bag. If Miss Ashford has been held captive for 3 days, she may require immediate care. He paused, then added softly, Constance, I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, I'm grateful to have met you. In just 2 days, you've reminded me why I chose my profession. The possibility of making a real difference, of standing for what's right even when it's difficult. Constance felt her breath catch at the earnest emotion in his voice. In the lamplight, his face was all planes and shadows, his gray eyes luminous with conviction. William, I feel the same, she said honestly. I've spent so long fighting to be taken seriously, to prove my worth in a profession that doesn't want me, that I'd forgotten what it was like to have a true partner, someone who respects my judgment and shares my dedication. For a moment, they simply stood there, looking at each other in the quiet street. Then Dr. Crawford offered his arm, and they walked together back to their adjacent boarding houses to prepare for the night ahead. An hour later, dressed in dark clothing and armed with the basement key, Constance's pistol, Dr. Crawford's medical bag, and a pair of lanterns, they set out for Brookline in a hired carriage. The driver was paid extra to wait for them on the road beyond the estate gates, far enough away not to be noticed, close enough to provide a quick escape if needed. The Ashford estate was dark and silent when they approached through the gardens, moving carefully through the shadows cast by the bare trees. The November moon was only a sliver, providing barely enough light to navigate by. They made their way to the east wing, where the old basement entrance was hidden behind the overgrown rhododendrons. Constance's hands trembled slightly as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. Mrs. Chen had kept it well oiled all these years. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a descending stone staircase that disappeared into absolute darkness. Stay close, Doctor. Crawford whispered, lighting one of the lanterns. And be ready for anything. They descended carefully, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. The air grew colder and damper as they went deeper, carrying a musty smell of earth and old stone. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large cellar divided into several chambers by ancient brick archways. The first few rooms were empty except for dust and cobwebs, clearly unused for years, just as Robert Ashford had claimed. But as they moved deeper into the basement, following a corridor that seemed to run the entire length of the house, they began to see signs of recent activity. Fresh footprints in the dust, modern lanterns hanging from hooks, and then, behind what appeared to be the old wine storage area, a heavy wooden door with a new lock gleaming in their lantern light. This must be it, Constance breathed. The safe Mrs. Chen mentioned must be beyond this door. But the lock was formidable, far beyond Constance's ability to pick. They stood there in frustration, so close to their goal yet unable to proceed. Then Dr. Crawford examined the hinges more closely. Constance, these hinges are on our side of the door, he said. If I can remove the pins, we can take the entire door off without needing to pick the lock. Using a small surgical knife from his medical bag as an improvised tool, Dr. Crawford worked at the hinges while Constance kept watch, her heart pounding. Every small sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The scrape of metal on metal, their own breathing, the distant creaking of the old house settling above them. Finally, the last hinge pin came free. Together, they carefully lifted the door away from its frame and set it aside. Beyond lay a small chamber, and in the center, a large iron safe, its door standing slightly ajar. But it was what they saw beyond the safe that made them both freeze in shock. Another door, partially concealed behind a false wall panel that had been pushed aside, and from beyond that door came the unmistakable sound of sobbing, a woman's voice, weak and terrified. "Catherine," Constance whispered and rushed forward. The hidden door opened into a cramped chamber that had clearly been designed as some sort of storage vault, but now served as a makeshift prison. In the corner, huddled on a thin blanket spread over the cold stone floor, was a young woman whose once elegant dress was now torn and filthy. Her auburn hair hung in disheveled tangles around her pale face, and her eyes, red from crying and lack of sleep, widened in disbelief as Constance and Dr. Crawford entered with their lanterns. "Miss Ashford?" Constance said gently, kneeling beside the trembling woman. "Catherine, we've come to help you. I'm Detective Constance Hayes, and this is Dr. William Crawford. You're safe now." Catherine began to sob in earnest, her whole body shaking with the release of 3 days of terror and despair. I thought no one would ever find me. I thought he would leave me here to die." Dr. Crawford immediately opened his medical bag and began a careful examination. "Miss Ashford, I'm a physician. I need to check that you haven't been seriously injured. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" "My wrists," Catherine said weakly, extending her hands. Constance felt rage surge through her at the sight of the raw, bloody marks where ropes had bound the young woman. "And my ankle. I think I twisted it when they threw me down here." While Dr. Crawford tended to Catherine's injuries with practiced gentleness, cleaning and bandaging her wrists and carefully examining her swollen ankle, Constance explored the rest of the hidden chamber. What she found made her blood run cold. The walls were lined with shelves containing ledgers, files, and stacks of documents. Clearly the records Robert Ashford had been so desperate to hide. But more disturbing was what she found in a corner beneath a tarpaulin. Several crates marked with shipping labels from New Bedford, their contents partially visible through broken slats. Inside were packages wrapped in oilcloth, and when Constance carefully opened one, she discovered it contained opium. "Dear God," she breathed. "He's been smuggling drugs. That's what this has all been about." Catherine's weak voice confirmed her suspicions. "It's been going on for years. Chinese opium brought in through New Bedford on ships that are supposed to be carrying legitimate cargo. My father built his entire fortune on it. The shipping company, this house, everything. It's all purchased with blood money." Dr. Crawford helped Catherine to her feet, supporting her carefully. "Can you walk? We need to get you out of here as quickly as possible." "I can manage," Catherine said, though her voice was unsteady. "But we can't just leave. Henry, Mr. Blackwood, he's here somewhere. They brought him down 2 nights ago. I heard him struggling, heard them beating him. He was still alive then, but I haven't heard anything since." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't involved him, if I hadn't been so naive to think we could expose my father without consequences." "Where did they take him?" Constance interrupted urgently. "Catherine, which direction did the sounds come from?" The young woman pointed deeper into the basement complex, toward the western side of the house. "That way. There are more chambers. I saw them briefly before they locked me in here. Storage rooms, old servants' quarters from when this was first built. Please, if there's any chance he's still alive." Constance exchanged a quick look with Dr. Crawford. They both knew that searching further into the basement increased their risk exponentially, but neither could contemplate leaving a man to die if there was any possibility of saving him. "William, can you get Catherine up to the surface?" Constance asked. "I'll search for Blackwood." "Absolutely not," Dr. Crawford said firmly. "We're not separating. Catherine can wait here by the entrance stairs where she'll be safe. You and I will search together." Catherine shook her head adamantly despite her weakened state. "No, I'm coming with you. Henry risked everything to help me understand the truth about my father. I won't abandon him now." There was a strength in her voice that reminded Constance of the courage it must have taken for this sheltered young woman to even consider betraying her own father. "Very well, but stay close and stay quiet." They moved deeper into the basement labyrinth. their lanterns casting eerie shadows on the ancient stonework. The chambers here were indeed older, part of the original construction. Low-ceilinged rooms with walls that wept moisture and floors covered in decades of accumulated grime. In the third chamber they explored, behind a collapsed section of shelving, they found Henry Blackwood. He was unconscious but alive, bound hand and foot and lying in a position that suggested he had been thrown there carelessly. His face was bruised and bloodied, and Dr. Crawford's immediate examination revealed at least 2 broken ribs and a severe concussion. "He needs a hospital urgently," the doctor said, his voice tight with controlled anger at the brutality that had been inflicted. "But first we need to get him out of here. The movement will be painful for him, but there's no alternative." Catherine knelt beside Blackwood, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Henry. I'm so terribly sorry." Dr. Crawford carefully cut the ropes binding Blackwood's hands and feet. Then, with Constance's help, managed to lift the unconscious man in a fireman's carry. It was awkward and difficult in the confined space, but Crawford was strong and determined. They began the slow journey back toward the entrance, Catherine limping along beside them. They had nearly reached the chamber with the safe when they heard voices from above. Multiple men descending the stairs from the house. Robert Ashford's voice was unmistakable, raised in anger. "I don't care what time it is. Something is wrong down here. That groundskeeper saw a lantern light from his cottage. Someone is in my basement, and I want to know who." Constance's mind raced. They were trapped. The only way out was through the very entrance the men were descending. She quickly extinguished her lantern and gestured for Dr. Crawford to do the same, plunging them into darkness. They moved silently back into the chamber with the safe, retreating behind the iron door they had removed earlier, which they carefully repositioned to provide some cover. "We need another way out," Constance whispered urgently to Catherine. "Are there any other exits from this basement?" Catherine's voice was barely audible in the darkness. "There used to be a coal chute on the north side. My father had it bricked up years ago, but if the brickwork isn't too solid—" "Show us," Dr. Crawford said, adjusting his grip on the unconscious Blackwood. Quickly, they moved through the darkness, guided by Catherine's whispered directions and the sound of Robert Ashford's voice growing closer as he and his men, she counted at least 3 others, spread through the basement searching. At any moment, they would discover the removed door and realize someone had breached their stronghold. The old coal chute was exactly where Catherine remembered, in a narrow chamber that smelled of ancient dust and decay. The opening had indeed been bricked up, but Dr. Crawford examined it quickly by feel and determined that the mortar was old and crumbling. "Constance, do you still have your pistol?" he asked quietly. She understood immediately what he intended. "Stand back," she warned. Then use the butt of the revolver to strike hard at the weakest point in the brickwork. The noise seemed catastrophically loud in the enclosed space, but the bricks began to give way. Several more strikes, and suddenly cold night air rushed in through a gap large enough to climb through. Behind them they heard shouts of alarm. The men had heard the noise and were converging on their position. "Catherine, you go first," Constance commanded. "Dr. Crawford, can you pass Mr. Blackwood up to her?" It was a desperate scramble. Catherine, despite her injured ankle, climbed through the opening with remarkable courage. Dr. Crawford managed to lift Blackwood's unconscious form high enough for Catherine to grab his arms and pull, while Constance helped push from below. The sound of running footsteps was growing closer. They had perhaps 30 seconds before discovery. Blackwood was through, though the rough handling made him groan in pain. "Doctor," Crawford turned to Constance. "Your turn, quickly." "Not without you," she said firmly. "For God's sake, woman, there's no time to argue." "Then don't argue. Boost me up and climb after me." Dr. Crawford clearly wanted to protest further, but the approaching footsteps made the decision for him. He lifted Constance by the waist with surprising strength, practically throwing her through the opening. She landed on the cold grass outside and immediately turned to reach back through for him. His hands grasped hers just as lamplight flooded the chamber below. Robert Ashford's enraged voice echoed up through the opening. "Stop right there!" But Dr. Crawford was already pulling himself up with Constance's help, his powerful shoulders clearing the opening just as hands grabbed at his legs. He kicked back hard, connecting with something solid that elicited a grunt of pain, then was through and rolling away from the opening. They were in the gardens on the north side of the estate, not far from where their carriage waited. Catherine had already managed to drag Blackwood several yards toward the gate, leaving a trail through the frost-covered grass. Constance and Dr. Crawford caught up to her quickly, and together they half-carried, half-dragged the injured man toward safety. Behind them, they could hear Robert Ashford shouting orders to his men, sending them to cut off the escape. But the basement had no other quick exits on this side of the house, and by the time the men could run through the mansion and out the front door, their quarry had too much of a head start. The carriage driver, bless him, had heard the commotion and brought the vehicle as close to the gates as he dared. Dr. Crawford lifted Blackwood's unconscious form into the carriage with Constance's help, then turned to assist Catherine. The young woman was trembling violently, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion. It was impossible to say. "Drive," Constance commanded the moment they were all inside. "Boston General Hospital as fast as these horses can manage." The carriage lurched forward just as Robert Ashford and two of his men burst through the estate gates. In the moonlight, Constance caught a glimpse of the industrialist's face, contorted with rage and something that might have been fear. He knew now that his secrets were exposed, that the evidence in his basement had been discovered. His empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The ride to Boston General seemed to take forever, though in reality it was less than 40 minutes. Dr. Crawford did what he could for Blackwood during the journey, checking his vital signs and ensuring his airway remained clear. Catherine sat in shocked silence, occasionally looking at Constance with an expression of profound gratitude, mixed with horror at all that had been revealed. "My mother," she said suddenly as they neared the hospital. "She doesn't know. She has no idea what my father really is. This will destroy her." "Your mother is stronger than you think," Constance said gently. "Mrs. Chen told us your mother was always kind to the staff, always generous. She's a good woman who was deceived by a bad man. She'll survive this, and so will you." At the hospital, Dr. Crawford's colleagues took over Blackwood's care with impressive efficiency. The clerk was still unconscious but stable, and the doctors assured them he would likely recover, though it would take time. Catherine was examined as well and, aside from exhaustion, dehydration, and her relatively minor injuries, was pronounced healthy enough to be released into Constance's custody. As dawn broke over Boston, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Constance stood in the hospital corridor with Dr. Crawford, both of them exhausted but triumphant. Catherine had finally fallen asleep in one of the private recovery rooms, watched over by a kindly nurse. "We need to go to the police now," Constance said, though her voice was heavy with fatigue. "I know a detective, Samuel Morrison, who's honest and won't be in Ashford's pocket. If we bring him the evidence from that basement, along with Catherine's and Blackwood's testimonies, we can ensure Ashford faces justice." "What about the documents?" Dr. Crawford asked. "We left them all in the basement. Ashford will surely destroy them now." Constance allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I took several of the most damaging ledgers when we were in that hidden chamber. I tucked them inside my coat while you were examining Catherine. I also memorized the locations and markings on those opium crates. It won't be everything, but combined with Catherine's first-hand knowledge and whatever Blackwood can tell us about the operation, it should be more than sufficient to convince the authorities to raid that basement before Ashford can destroy all the evidence." Dr. Crawford looked at her with undisguised admiration. "You're remarkable, Constance Hayes. Truly remarkable." She felt warmth spread through her chest despite her exhaustion. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, William. Your medical expertise saved both Catherine and Henry. Your courage in that basement, your quick thinking. You were everything I could have hoped for in a partner." "A partner," Dr. Crawford repeated softly, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Is that what we are, Constance?" "I think," she said carefully, her heart beating faster, "that we could be much more than that, if you're interested in such a possibility." In response, Dr. Crawford took her hand in his touch warm and steady. "I have been interested in such a possibility since the moment I met you in that rain-soaked street. You're brilliant, brave, and dedicated to justice. Everything I admire most in a person. I know we've only just met, and perhaps this is too forward, but I find myself hoping very much that this is the beginning of something lasting between us." Constance squeezed his hand, allowing herself to smile despite her fatigue. "I believe it is, William. I very much believe it is." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Detective Morrison, a grizzled veteran with sharp eyes and an incorruptible reputation, listened to their account with growing outrage. He assembled a team of trusted officers and obtained a warrant to search the Ashford estate. By mid-morning, they had raided the mansion and secured all the evidence from the basement before Robert Ashford could destroy it. Ashford himself was arrested while attempting to flee to New Bedford. His associates in the smuggling operation, including several corrupt customs officials, were also taken into custody. The scandal rocked Boston society for months, but justice was ultimately served. Robert Ashford was convicted of drug smuggling, kidnapping, and assault, sentenced to 20 years in prison. Catherine recovered slowly from her ordeal, both physically and emotionally. Her mother, once the initial shock wore off, proved to be exactly as strong as Constance had predicted. Margaret Ashford divorced her husband, sold the estate, and used what remained of their legitimate assets to establish a charitable foundation supporting victims of addiction. Catherine worked alongside her mother in this endeavor, finding purpose and healing in helping others. Henry Blackwood recovered from his injuries over several months. He testified at Ashford's trial with courage and clarity, and his documentation of the smuggling operation proved crucial to the prosecution. He and Catherine developed a deep friendship through their shared ordeal, though both needed time to heal before considering anything more romantic. As for Constance and William, their partnership, both professional and personal, flourished in the weeks and months that followed. William's medical expertise became invaluable to several of Constance's subsequent investigations, and the Boston Police Department eventually created an official position for him as a consulting forensic physician. His presence also lent additional credibility to Constance's work, helping overcome some of the resistance she had faced as a woman in a male-dominated profession. By the following spring, their relationship had deepened into genuine love. William proposed on a warm May evening as they walked through the public garden, where the flowers were in full bloom. Constance accepted without hesitation, knowing that she had found not just a husband but a true partner, someone who respected her mind, supported her ambitions, and shared her dedication to justice and truth. They were married in a small ceremony in June 1903, with Catherine and her mother in attendance, along with Mrs. Pemberton, Mrs. Chen, and a small gathering of friends and colleagues. Detective Morrison gave a toast, praising them both for their courage and skill in bringing down the Ashford smuggling ring. Even Henry Blackwood attended, still moving carefully due to his lingering injuries but smiling broadly throughout the celebration. As Constance and William stood together in Mrs. Pemberton's garden where the reception was held, watching the sunset paint the Boston sky in shades of gold and amber, Constance reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that rainy November evening, when she had quite literally collided with a stranger on Charles Street. "What are you thinking about?" William asked softly, his arm around her waist. "About fate," Constance replied, leaning into his embrace. "About how one chance encounter can change everything. If it hadn't been raining that night, if you hadn't been leaving that bookshop at precisely that moment, if I hadn't been distracted by thoughts of the Ashford case, then we would have met some other way," William said with quiet conviction. "I believe that some things are meant to be, Constance. Some partnerships are inevitable." She turned to face him, rising on her toes to kiss him gently. "I believe you're right. And I'm grateful every day that fate brought us together, even if it did involve breaking into basements, dodging criminals, and generally risking life and limb." William laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Life with you will never be boring, Mrs. Crawford. I'm counting on it." And indeed, their life together proved to be anything but boring. Constance continued her investigative work with William as her partner, and together they solved dozens of cases over the years, their complementary skills and unwavering mutual support making them one of the most formidable investigative teams in Boston. They faced dangers and challenges, certainly, but they faced them together. Two people who had found in each other not just romantic love but profound respect, genuine partnership, and enduring friendship. Years later, when they were old and gray and looking back on their extraordinary life together, William would always say that the best decision he ever made was walking out of that bookshop on a rainy November evening. And Constance would smile and agree that opening that basement door at the Ashford estate and finding not just a missing woman but the beginning of her greatest adventure had been the moment everything changed. But it wasn't just opening the basement door that had changed everything. It was what happened afterward, when her eyes lit up, not at what she saw in that dark chamber, but at the realization that she had found her true partner standing beside her. The man who would share not just that investigation, but every investigation, every challenge, every triumph and heartbreak that life would bring. In William Crawford, she had discovered something far more valuable than any case she could ever solve. She had found home, partnership, and love that would last a lifetime. And in that rain-soaked city where they had met by chance and fallen in love through courage and shared purpose, their story became the stuff of legend. A reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries lead not just to justice, but to joy.